Jquery UI and Bootstrap for basic formatting. In this tutorial, we are going to talk about how to install Jquery UI through npm. In the first part of the tutorial, we are going to install Jquery UI in our web application. It consists of the following steps. We are going to discuss the differences between Jquery UI npm package versus Jquery UI bundle npm package, and why we use one versus the other. And then we are going to link Jquery Ui Css style sheet and load in Jquery Ui JavaScript. Then we position Jquery Ui slider within our HTML file. Then we start up the Jquery Ui slider to the target position in the HTML file. After that, we are going to introduce Bootstrap for basic formatting. We are going to talk about container versus fluid. This is the top level Bootstrap for component for displaying an HTML in a kind of like a grid system that is provided by Bootstrap 4. Then we're going to discuss about role, how we set up a role within the Bootstrap 4 grid system, as well as the column. Last week, we discussed on how and why do we use a require.js library in order to load JavaScript. This week, let's go into the practical coding in terms of how do we use that. From the previous tutorial, we have already set up Bootstrap 4 into our application, but since Bootstrap 4 is a little bit of a complex JavaScript library, it requires jQuery as well as proper.js. We are going to install one more library, which is a simpler one, the Jquery Ui Library. Let's say, for example, the requirement is we have to use a slider widget that is provided by the Jquery Ui Library. If we take a look at the Bootstrap 4 library, let's bring up the browser. From the Bootstrap 4 library, we couldn't find a slider component. However, in Jquery UI, we do have a slider component. So let's take a look at how can we implement the slider component using the Jquery UI. And that will kind of force us, or somehow we need to install the Jquery Ui library. So out of the source code, we need to do 4 different things. The first thing is the Jquery Ui Css. So similar to the Bootstrap CSS, we need to install or have a link to the Jquery Ui CSS. The second thing we need to do is to load in the JavaScript library. Note that we need to load in the Jquery Ui library and the Jquery library, but in the order of Jquery library first and then Jquery Ui library after. The third thing we need to do is to install or to activate the slider component in Jquery in order to identify a location in the DOM that we need to put the slider component. We need to specify a CSS selector. In this particular case, we are using the slider ID selector. So in here, the fourth thing we need to do is to have a location where we kind of physically put the slider on the screen. So let's do that. Again, before we change any of our code, it is always a good practice to start the application first. So let's run npm run dev. Okay, let's test it out. So again, the button is working. Now let's install the Jquery Ui library because we have already got the Jquery library. So we don't need to install the Jquery library again. Let's install the Jquery Ui library. So let's run that. Let's go to the node modules and find the Jquery Ui. Let's expand that. Notice that we cannot find the jQuery UI JavaScript in here from the root folder, but we found the build script grunt file. So let's open that. Let's look for the task default, because that's the default task. If you run just run grunt, it will call this. So from here we have the lint, which is checking for linting, checking JavaScript error or styling. It doesn't do any building. Require.js, this is probably the building. And the test is just verification. So test, we are just running QUnit, so we don't need to worry about that. So the only thing that is left is require.js. That's for the building. So let's search for require.js. So in here, from the grunt init config, we realize that this is the building part. Let's take a look at another part. So this is just text. So this is the one. If we take a look at this, just skip most of the stuff, but look for out, because this is the output folder for this particular build. In here, it specifies it is in the distribution folder, and the file is jQuery Ui Js. So let's take a look at the jQuery UI folder and look for the distribution folder. Notice that the distribution folder is not in here. That means we have to perform an actual build in this package in order to create that jQuery UI.js. From a library development standpoint, this is correct. But from an application developer standpoint, this is not usable because we need to build an actual Node.js module before we can use it. Let's look for another library which does the actual bundling, which has the actual finished product of the jQuery Ui JS. This particular package right here is not suitable for the browser consumption. So let's install another one. Which is called Jquery Ui Bundle. Let's run that. Okay, let's go to the Node modules and take a look at the Jquery Ui Bundle. Let's collapse this and expand that. So inside the Jquery Ui Bundle, we have the Jquery Ui.css, which is the one we need to use from here, as well as the Jquery Ui.js, which is what we need to use again right here. So this particular Jquery Ui bundle library is suitable for the browser consumption. So let's use this. Okay, let's go back to the editor. Remember, we have 4 different steps in order to install the Jquery Ui slider library, as well as using it, of course. So the first step is to put in the CSS. So let's duplicate that. Let's specify the path Jquery Ui bundle. And since it is at the root directory of this library, so let's just put in the correct path. Jquery Ui CSS. That's the first step. The second step is to install the actual JavaScript library. Copy that, paste that. Jquery Ui bundle. And Jquery Ui.js. So that's the second step. So we have the jQuery and the Jquery Ui beneath it, because we need to load in the jQuery first before we load Jquery Ui. The third step is to put in the position where we would like to put the slider. So let's go in here div, let's put a paragraph there, and then div id equals to slider, close div. So this is the location of putting in the div. Before we run the actual JavaScript code, let's take a look at where is this slider. It shouldn't be displaying. So just for showing the actual slider in here, we just put slider right there, and then say slider. Okay, let's save it. So the slider should be located in between these two slider keyword, or it's actually a text. The next thing we got to do is to identify this should be a slider using JavaScript code. So in here we do a JavaScript, like a script tag. So we put in the JavaScript code where jQuery is waiting for the ready of the page, and then it will run the following code inside. So this is the CSS selector slider. Notice that this slider must be the same as that, otherwise it won't work. And then dot slider, we call the slider function of the jQuery to identify this is the slider right there. All right, let's save it. Let's take a look. So this actual slider is here. It's in between this word and that word. So it's identified by the div. Let's do some cleanup. Let's remove the slider tags. Save it. Still there. Good. Before we put in the required JS library, let's format the display such that it looks nicer. Since we have already got Bootstrap working, let's put in the proper Bootstrap code. So in Bootstrap, what we got to do is to kind of initialize the actual container for the Bootstrap library. How do we do that? Is to create a div, a class equals to container. And then let's close it right here. All right. Let's format individual elements to be a different role. So let's do another div, class, role. Then we put in a role right here. And then one more div, column. Let's make it 12 column, medium 12 column. So in here, we actually show that Bootstrap is actually kind of like a grid system. The whole thing is a container or container fluid. And then it is a role-based thing. So we can divide it by individual roles. And then we have the column. So by using row and column, we have a grid system in the Bootstrap. Within Bootstrap, there are 12 columns. So in effect, this is taking up the entire row within this particular row. So let's format the other rows as well. Div, class, the second row. Okay, we put it back here. Let's remove the paragraph for now. And then we need the column. Let's put 6 so that we have a half half row for the slider. Okay. And then there's a drop down. So again, we do the same thing. Div class row. And then div class. This time it doesn't really matter. Let's put in the entire row again. So let's put it here. And then we format this. Oops. All right. I think it's one column too much. That should be right. Okay. And then the fourth row. So class column medium 12. Let's take this, put it here. Okay. So let's take a look at what do we have here. Just a second. Let me. So we have put in 4 rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that the slider is only taking half of the entire row. Okay, because we are using a 6 right here. So for example, if we change this 6 to 12, save it, it will become the full length. All right. Say if we put in 9, it will become like 3/4. All right. And if we change the container to be fluid, then it would take up the entire thing, the entire space. Notice that we are still taking the 9, like 3/4 of the entire length. If we make it to 12, it should take up the full length. So it actually takes up the full length right here. All right. That's it for this week. I'm going to migrate these libraries to Require.js in the next episode. Thank you.